Welcome to the bonus episode for the Mama Murder Podcast Patreon family. Let's get it, y'all. This month's bonus episode is Abraham Shakespeare. Abraham was born on April 24th, 1966, and he was raised in Florida. Abraham came from a really good family. He was raised with good traditional family values, and even though the family didn't have much money, they did have plenty of love and respect to go around. Abraham was extremely well-mannered, but school really wasn't his strongest subject. He was more of a hard worker than he was a good student. Abraham was actually illiterate. He'd never learned to read or write as a kid or in school. And that's probably because he dropped out of school in the 7th grade. Which, this was the 60s and 70s, so it wasn't really unheard of or even illegal like it is today. But when Abraham dropped out of school, he went to work at a citrus farm with his dad, presumably picking oranges and lemons and limes for grocery stores in the area. Abraham would also do odd jobs around the citrus farm while he worked there too. He would help fix water lines that ran through and watered all the plants. Abraham was extremely handy, but he also had no problem doing hard manual labor, like helping dig things up, lifting and carrying boxes around the farm, and things like that. And Florida is a lot like South Carolina, where the weather is just bipolar, and summers are nothing less than extreme heat and constant humidity. And even in those hot, humid working conditions, Abraham was always reported as a super hard worker, a super reliable employee, and he was also known to always bring a good attitude with him to work. He never had a bad day. But when Abraham was 13 years old, he was arrested for theft. And I didn't really look into that because 13 years old is pretty young and it was probably something really stupid. But he was arrested for theft, and even though he was a good, reliable employee, he was also just 13 years old. So after his arrest, Abraham was sent to a reform school until he turned 18, which is crazy to me. Kids do stupid things all of the time. And Abraham had never been in trouble, and he wasn't known for, causing and starting trouble before this either. And as much as I hate to even bring it up, Abraham was a young black man, and this seems to kind of play a big role in him being sent to reform school with no warning, no slap on the wrist, and no second chance. Because as much as we all hate to think about things like this was something that was pretty regular and would happen pretty often in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And even though a lot of reform schools are pretty awful, especially at this time, the one Abraham went to didn't really seem to be that bad. It didn't seem to be that kind of reform school. When Abraham was 18, he was finally released from this reform school and he moved back in with his dad. And as soon as he settled into his dad's and was out of reform school, Abraham was back on the hunt for work again. And during this time, Abraham would do odd jobs for different people all over town. He would cut grass, help with your garden, work on your car. Just anything and everything that he could find to do to make money is what he was doing. And then Abraham found himself a real job, a steady, paying job. Abraham got a job as a trucker's assistant for a food distribution company. And since Abraham couldn't read or write, he wasn't able to get a driver's license. So Abraham would essentially just ride around with the truck drivers of these delivery trucks, and he would help them load and unload things from the delivery truck when they got to wherever the truck was supposed to be dropping their loads and goods off from. Now, Abraham was the kind of friend that we all hope that we can be for someone else. He was always the first one to offer a helping hand, and he never expected anything in return. If Abraham told you he was going to be somewhere, then you didn't have to wonder or guess if he would show up, because he always showed up. And once he was getting his life back on track with this job and a steady place to live, he started dating a woman by the name of Antoinette. Abraham and Antoinette had known each other since childhood, and the two had dated for a few years. And then in 2001, the two welcomed their first son to the world, a son that they named Moses, which these are some very poetic names. Antoinette and Abraham and Moses, Shakespeare. These names just sound like this, awesome family unit that you just want to be a part of. But the happy family unit would soon split up. Abraham and Antoinette decided that things just weren't working out. Abraham was put on child support for his son, Moses. Now, Abraham did struggle to make these child support payments, and he often fell behind on them for months at a time. Even though he was struggling to make his child support payments, he was still extremely involved in his son Moses' life. And I don't know about y'all, but I would rather have a broke dad that's present than a rich dad that's absent, but that could very well just be me. Abraham would get Moses at least 3 or 4 days out of the week, and the two were extremely close. Even though he was extremely present as a father, he had, over time, gotten about $8,000 behind on his child support, which was kind of why he was arrested again in October of 2006. Abraham stayed in a correctional facility for 3 days for his back child support payments until he was finally able to make a payment of $200 to the back pay, whatever. After he was able to pay this $200 back pay payment, Abraham was released from jail. Now, he had fallen on hard times and was at least there for his son in the way that it mattered most, but things were about to turn around for Abraham in a major, major way. In November of 2006, so right after he was released from jail for not being able to pay his child support, Abraham and a coworker by the name of Mike had stopped by a gas station. Mike had ran into the gas station to grab a few things, probably pay for gas, whatever. And since Mike was already going into the store to grab some things, Abraham just asked Mike to grab him 2 lottery tickets while he was inside the store. Abraham gave the coworker Mike $2 to buy 2 separate lottery tickets. And when Mike got back out to the trunk, he gave Abraham both of the lottery tickets that he'd asked Mike to grab while he was already inside the store. Abraham had a total of $5 to his name that day, and he had just used 2 out of those $3 on lottery tickets. The chances were slim to none. The odds were about 1 in over 13 million chance of Abraham actually winning anything on those lottery tickets that he'd just gotten. The lottery had been up to $31 million at the time, and one of those 2 tickets that Abraham had gotten Mike to grab out of the gas station had matching numbers. Abraham had actually won. He'd had $5 to his name and was still $8,000 behind in debt on child support, and he'd just won $31 million. There were no other winning numbers reported, so there was no one that Abraham would have to split his winnings, the payout of his winnings with. So Abraham was given 2 different options on how he wanted to collect his winnings. Abraham had the option of taking a smaller monthly payment over the next 30 years of his life, or he could take the one large lump sum of money with taxes and things like that already taken out. And Abraham opted for the one large lump sum all at once. After taxes were taken out and after Uncle Sam took whatever he wanted, Abraham ended up getting $17 million. Now, he would only end up walking away, the final amount that he would walk away with, $12.7 million. I'm going to stop right here because how did he go from $31 million, then to $17 million, and then all the way down to $12.7 million? Like, 12.7 is a lot, yeah, but we started at $31 million. Like, I'll never understand how Uncle Sam can just take, but I'm getting off topic. Like, the government had taken well over half of Abraham's winnings before he'd ever even got to touch the money. But Abraham had just been struggling to pay his bills, struggling to keep up with his child support payments, and struggling to make it paycheck to paycheck. He had gone from all this to a man walking around with $12.7 million. He'd gone from broke and struggling to a multi-millionaire literally overnight. This would be a drastic change for anybody, but especially for someone who'd always lived a very simple, very normal life like Abraham. He'd literally spent 2 out of the last $5 that he had to his name to buy these 2 lottery tickets, and he'd won. He was thrilled, and probably overwhelmed to say the least. Now, a fun random fact that I found while I was doing the research on Abraham is that Abraham's ex-girlfriend and his baby mama to Moses, Antoinette, she had actually won $1 million on a $20 scratch-off Monopoly ticket in 2017. And after they'd taken taxes or whatever out of her $1 million winning amount, she ended up walking home with a total of $770,000 out of $1 million. But what are the chances that 2 people that had dated and had a baby together would then go on to hit the lottery for more than $1 million at 2 different times? Like, the chances of that are probably astronomical. Anyways, back to Abraham. After Abraham had collected his winnings, he'd done an interview in which he said, quote, "I don't have to struggle anymore," which just kind of shows you where his head was. But Abraham was a dad above all else, so of course, the first thing that he did with his winnings was pay off his entire child support amount that he'd been behind on. And immediately afterwards, he set up a trust for his son Moses for $1 million. Now, with his son taken care of, you would think that Abraham would have started living his best life and buying things that he'd always wanted or eating in restaurants that he'd never been able to afford before, but that's not what he did. That's actually not even close to what he did. Abraham had always been the kind of guy that just never had a bad day, even well before he hit the lottery. He was just a naturally kind, happy person who worried about making everybody else's life easier or better any chance that he got. So what did Abraham actually do with the money after he'd paid up his child support and set up a trust for his son? Well, he started taking care of everyone around him. Everyone but himself. Abraham bought his cousin Cedric a whole-ass house, and Abraham also paid off mortgage loans for literally everybody. And when I say everyone, I mean that in the most literal way possible. Abraham paid off a $185,000 mortgage for a friend of his. He'd also helped a neighbor by paying off their $53,000 mortgage. He'd also paid off another $60,000 mortgage for a man that he did not know. And when I say that he did not know this person, I mean that Abraham did not even know this guy's last name, and he just helped him pay off a $60,000 mortgage. Now, out of all the things that Abraham was helping other people buy and pay off, the only thing that he'd actually bought himself was a house. It was a nice house, but it wasn't like extreme and over the top. And the house that Abraham bought himself was in a gated community, and he'd paid a little over $1 million for it. Now, Abraham couldn't forget about his mom. Obviously, she had always been there, and she'd always helped Abraham in any way that she could. Even when she didn't really have it to help, she'd always done her best. Now, the house that Abraham had bought himself had a pretty swanky mother-in-law suite in the back of the house, which Abraham wanted his mom to move into so that the two could be closer. Abraham's mom came by to check out the house and to check out the new swanky mother-in-law suite, and when she did, she told the show Stranger in My House that she couldn't really explain it and she didn't really know why, but that there was something wrong with that house. She basically said that there was no way in hell that she could live in that house, but she couldn't explain why. Now, later on, Abraham did end up buying himself a BMW, which was his dream car, and he'd bought like a small Ford sedan type of car as well. But he still wasn't out buying just everything he'd ever wanted and everything he'd ever dreamed of having and everything he never could afford. He was very much just buying himself the basic things that he couldn't really afford to buy before. Like a house, a couple of cars, and that was really it. Abraham still shopped for his clothes out of Walmart, and when he finally broke down and bought himself a Rolex, he bought it used from a local pawn shop in the area. And between all the different family members and friends that Abraham had been helping and paying off like things like their mortgages and their car notes, Abraham ended up spending around $1.75 million just between everybody that he'd helped since he'd hit the lottery. But that was just the kind of person that he was. And money really wasn't going to change that about him. Abraham had also started helping people in the community as well. Abraham would pay for random people's funeral expenses, and he wasn't done helping yet. Abraham then started buying houses for people that he knew, or even people that he didn't know. And the way he would do it was that he would buy these houses with cash and then let these people make their monthly payments to him instead of making the monthly mortgage payments every month to the bank. So now people weren't having to worry about getting approved from the bank or their payments being higher than they could afford, because Abraham would put the houses in his name and just let these people pay him back every month. But normally when people are this generous, they end up being taken advantage of, and that's exactly what ended up happening to Abraham. Especially since Abraham had always struggled to make ends meet himself, he had a really hard time telling people no when they would ask him for money or basically anything. especially when they would ask Abraham to borrow money for things that you actually need to survive, like food, housing, bills, etc. And people were constantly around Abraham asking for money, asking to borrow this or asking to have that, and it was constant. It was becoming never-ending. Abraham even told a reporter that he thought all these people were his friends at first, but he was slowly realizing that they were only around for him and his money and what he could do to benefit them. Abraham had just been given this opportunity to set himself up and to even be able to set up his family for generations to come. But with people constantly around with their hands out and Abraham not having the heart to say no, this would never happen at the rate that he was going. People had just stopped going to the bank altogether, and instead they showed up at Abraham's house. And they did this for a reason. Because the bank doesn't look at your credit or your falling apart finances and feel bad for you and give you a loan. They literally tell people no all day long about borrowing money, and Abraham didn't have the heart to say no, and people were starting to realize that. And Abraham knew that a lot of the people that were coming to him for help would have been turned down by the bank, even if they had gone to the bank before they'd come to Abraham asking for money. He knew that the banks would deny their loan request, and of course, Abraham was saying yes to everyone. Even people he'd never met before. Abraham had even told his brother at one point that he'd been better off when he was broke. Which sucks because he hadn't been required to help anybody. He'd helped enough people already that his good karma jar should have been overflowing into the ocean by now. Abraham's newfound financial freedom had actually ended up being more of a bad thing than a good thing, hence the terms, more money, more problems. Abraham had gone from a guy who was struggling to pay a few simple bills to someone with multiple mortgages, and him having to keep up with whose mortgage payment he was supposed to be collecting on what day, for how much, who was behind, who wasn't. He was also having to keep up with which mortgage belonged to which person and which person had missed this payment or had made double this payment. And he was dealing with this almost daily at this point because he had helped so many different people with mortgage loans and housing debt. And it got to a point where Abraham was so overwhelmed with all the people showing up at his house and all of the mortgage payments and the loans that he was having to keep up with that he eventually left his brand new, fancy-ass house and he went to hide out at his best friend Greg's house for a few days. And he did this just so people wouldn't know where to find him to be able to bother him about money. So, remember the guy Mike, the one that had actually gone into the gas station and bought the winning lottery ticket for Abraham? Also with Abraham's money? He'd actually tried to sue Abraham after Abraham had won the $31 million lottery. And in this lawsuit, Mike claimed that those 2 lottery tickets had actually been his. He also claimed that the tickets had been in his wallet and that somehow Abraham had been able to get into his wallet and steal those 2 lottery tickets. So how did Abraham get into Mike's wallet? How did Mike know that it was these two very specific lottery tickets that had just so happened to be winners and that these were the same ones that Abraham had supposedly stolen? Now, Mike wasn't the brightest crayon in the pack, because he'd actually gone to work where he and Abraham were co-workers, and he had bragged about being the one that had bought the 2 tickets for Abraham with Abraham's own money. And he did this bragging right after everyone learned that Abraham had actually won the lottery. So he kind of told on himself for lying by telling all of his co-workers that he had been the one to buy those 2 tickets for Abraham that day. Thankfully, all of those people that Mike had bragged about this to, they all showed up and testified that Mike had in fact told them out of his own mouth that Abraham had given him the money for those 2 tickets and that Mike had only went into the gas station and been the one to buy them. So the judge decided that legally, all of the winnings did rightfully belong to Abraham. So at least this is a little bit of Abraham's good karma coming back around to him. Now, in 2008, Abraham ended up having another son with a woman named Centoya. Now, he and Centoya had started dating after he'd won the lottery. But Abraham and Centoya split up not long after she had their son. And around the same time that this was going on, Abraham also met a woman by the name of Doris Moore, better known as Dee Dee. Dee Dee had actually met Abraham's realtor at a small business convention, and Dee Dee kind of hinted around to the realtor that she wanted to write a book about Abraham's life. And by the time Dee Dee and Abraham actually met, Abraham only had about $3.5 million in assets left. For example, all the mortgages that Abraham had on his name and any other properties and vehicles that he'd helped people with. So he only had about $1.5 million in cash left from his winnings. So he'd essentially already spent through 2/3 of his winnings in about 2 years. And he'd spent it on everyone else. Now, after Dee Dee and Abraham had gotten to know each other a little bit better, Dee Dee pointed out that she thought that Abraham was having a hard time managing his finances, which obviously he was. He'd been broke and struggling throughout his entire life up until he was handed over $10 million, which most people don't just know how to manage that kind of money. Like, you really don't have to manage all that much when you're broke because you don't have much to manage. You just have to figure out how to make it until your next payday. And eventually, after some talking it through, Dee Dee convinced Abraham that she would be his new financial advisor. But Abraham's realtor and Abraham himself had never looked into Dee Dee's past or even so much as bothered to check her resume and references. So Abraham didn't really look at anything or ask any questions about what would qualify Dee Dee to be his financial advisor. No one ever checked to see if Dee Dee had any experience as a financial advisor. No one checked to see if she was a writer like she claimed. No one checked on anything that she said. Abraham just kind of blindly trusted Dee Dee with everything. And if they would have looked into her at all, they would have found that she had absolutely no experience as a financial advisor. They would have also found that she wasn't a writer, and that basically everything that she'd said to Abraham had been a lie. If they would have looked into Dee Dee at all, they would have seen that she was actually charged with false police reports of both a carjacking and a rape in 2001. They may have also seen that she'd blackmailed a company that she'd worked for earlier to get them to drop charges that the company was planning on filing against her because she had stolen more than $100,000 from them. And if my memory serves me correct, Dee Dee had been working at this medical company, and they'd finally kind of put it together and realized that she had stolen over $100,000 from this company. So when they were taking her to court, Dee Dee blackmailed this medical company by saying that she would tell all the media outlets and news reporters that this medical company had been injecting people with AIDS on purpose, which they had not been doing. So I'm not sure why that would have needed to be blackmail. Like, I would have been like, do it. It's like, so what? But they didn't. The charges would end up being dropped at a later date, unfortunately. And from what I understood, this medical company had finally noticed that large sums of money weren't being accounted for and that Dee Dee was the only person in the company who could never explain why the money she was in charge of was missing and why she could never account for where it had gone. Now, Dee Dee was officially Abraham's financial advisor, and he didn't know a single thing about these claims or these charges against Dee Dee. And now that she was going to be Abraham's financial advisor, she would be in charge of all of his assets. All of those mortgage payments that he was supposed to be collecting every month from all those different people that he'd loaned these large sums of money out to. Dee Dee would also be in charge of all that, along with the properties and mortgages and things that would still be in Abraham's name. So, I guess that's good. She was just supposed to be helping relieve some of Abraham's stress over his finances. Dee Dee was then signed onto all of Abraham's bank accounts and even given access to be able to spend, move, and invest money. And basically anything else that she felt like she needed to do with Abraham's money, she could do. Essentially anything that Abraham could do on his own at the bank, Dee Dee now had permission to do all of these things as well. It would kind of be set up like a joint bank account, but for a business. There was also a company that Dee Dee was running that belonged to her. And this was a business that she'd already had when she and Abraham first met. And Dee Dee made it out like she could help Abraham with his next business moves too, by using her own company and using the skills that she'd learned over the course of being a business owner herself. Dee Dee was supposed to have Abraham's best interest at heart. She was supposed to be doing what was best for Abraham and his family, and Abraham was just blindly trusting her to do so. And when 2008 rolled around, Abraham had cashed in an annuity account worth about $250,000. And he'd cashed this out and moved it into Dee Dee's business account. Abraham was under the impression that Dee Dee would be using this money to pay his taxes for him. This would be one less thing for him to worry about doing, and That's what she's here for, after all. But in all actuality, Dee Dee would use this $250,000 that Abraham had cashed out, and she would go out and live her best life on this annuity account that Abraham had cashed out to pay his taxes with. And there are still no documents that can prove that Dee Dee ever even paid the taxes for Abraham at all. Dee Dee was using this money to buy herself flashy and expensive things, but she wasn't greedy. Dee Dee was also given large sums of money that she'd essentially stolen from Abraham over to her 23-year-old boyfriend, Shar. Dee Dee was 34 and her boyfriend, Shar, was 23. Which she could have given him every dime she had and no one would have cared, but this wasn't her money to be given away. That's where the problem is. Another little random fun fact, Dee Dee was actually still married while she was dating her 23-year-old boyfriend, Shar. And I'm not even saying this to sound mean or to sound hateful. You can look it up for yourself. Everything I've read basically said that Dee Dee wasn't like hot shit like you would think based on the way she's acting. Which your personality and your attitude can really hype up or kill your prettiness or handsome factor a lot. Now, after this, Dee Dee talked Abraham into signing over a quit claims deed. This is basically the easiest and quickest way to have a deed signed over to someone else. And it was the deed to the house that Abraham had bought for himself. One of the few and only things he had bought for himself. And by 2009, a lawyer named Howard, who was introduced to Abraham, of course, by Dee Dee, had drawn up all the necessary paperwork for a asset purchase agreement, and this paperwork needed to be signed in order for Abraham to be able to sign over all these properties into Dee Dee's company's name. So, if you haven't put this all together by now, Dee Dee's a con woman, and she's a damn good one at that. So basically the agreement that was drawn up said that Dee Dee would be buying all of Abraham's assets, mortgages, and everything else. But in reality, Dee Dee had been able to talk Abraham into basically selling her all these assets so that she could manage them. So basically the complete opposite of what Dee Dee and the lawyer Howard had been telling Abraham that the paperwork said. But the way that Dee Dee had worded it and the way that she'd kind of worked it out, she was actually getting all of Abraham's assets for less than 5 cents on every dollar. So again, she's just taken everything he had. Meanwhile, Dee Dee had gotten herself a Lincoln MKS, which is a pretty pricey car, and she'd put that car that she'd just bought into Abraham's name under the business name Abraham Shakespeare, LLC. So on paper, this looked like a company car that would be used for company purposes, except for the fact that Abraham Shakespeare, LLC was not a real company. Dee Dee had completely made this LLC company up out of thin air. And Dee Dee had traded that BMW that Abraham had bought for himself for the Lincoln MKS, and while she had it, she put that BMW into her boyfriend's name. Now, the only reason that I could think of that she was able to get away with any of this would be the fact that Abraham couldn't read or write. So she could likely tell him whatever sounded good to get him to sign these titles and all these other agreements and documents that she needed his signature on. And Abraham wasn't aware of any of the things that Dee Dee was doing. He honestly trusted her with every cent that he had. And why he felt like he could trust her, we'll never really know. He probably thought that Dee Dee was honestly doing what she had told him she was good at, running a successful business. And eventually, things would escalate. The bank that Abraham used got a fax. Now, this fax was a request to empty all of Abraham's bank accounts, and it said that all of this money needed to be sent in a check, and it needed to be sent over to Abraham's home address. Now remember, Dee Dee could do this because Abraham had given her full and complete access to everything in all of his accounts. There wasn't anything that Abraham could do with his money and with these accounts that Dee Dee couldn't do. Now, once all of Abraham's accounts had been completely emptied, that's when Dee Dee actually made Abraham Shakespeare LLC a legal and binding LLC. And of course, Dee Dee did this for her own benefit, obviously, and not for the benefit of Abraham at all. So all of this money was supposed to be transferred over to the LLC, which was now a real legal binding LLC that the money could be transferred to. There was a little over $1 million in this account that Dee Dee had just emptied and transferred over to Abraham Shakespeare LLC. And from my understanding, since Dee Dee had been given access to all of Abraham's accounts and his assets, and now that this LLC was a real legal LLC, I don't actually think any of this is illegal. As screwed up as it sounds, it seems legal from everything I could read and figure out. Now, this LLC had its own bank account at a Bank of America that Dee Dee had opened, just for this LLC name. There's only one problem with all of this, though. Abraham's name wasn't on this bank account that Dee Dee opened with the Bank of America. So now he doesn't even have access to his own money. Abraham's assistant had requested a meeting with Dee Dee where she told Dee Dee that Abraham's name was going to have to be added to those accounts through the Bank of America. And Dee Dee agreed. That's good. She's kind, she's sweet, whatever. Dee Dee allowed Abraham's name to be added to this account with his money in it. Let me say this again for the people in the back. Dee Dee allowed Abraham's name to be added to the account that Dee Dee had moved all of his money to. She allowed him. So nice of her. I'm pretty sure you could probably hear my eyes rolling at this point. Now, Abraham's name had been added to this account, but it was only added for a whole last 6 days before Dee Dee went in and requested that his name be taken off the account again. And Dee Dee claimed that she had to take Abraham's name off of this account because he was refusing to pay taxes on this money. And that's a no-no. So just like that, Abraham's name had been taken off of the accounts with every cent that he had to his name in it. And after this, it took Dee Dee a matter of weeks to drain Abraham's account down to about $44,000. So Dee Dee had moved all of Abraham's money from the original account that he had. It was now moved to this account with this LLC, which she had removed Abraham's name from. So now he doesn't even have access to his own money, but Dee Dee has access to all of it. And she's draining his accounts to practically pennies compared to what he started with. So Abraham wouldn't have been able to touch this money even if he would have figured out what was going on and tried. He would have been denied by the bank. Dee Dee was writing checks and depositing these checks into her own company account. She ended up writing over $450,000 worth of checks from the last of Abraham's money, and she wasn't being shy with her spending either. She'd gotten herself a new house, a Hummer, a Corvette, and a slew of new toys for her 23-year-old boyfriend, Shar. And I was thinking about this too, and Abraham probably wasn't thinking much about Dee Dee's big spending habits either, because he thought that she had her very own, successful business, which was one of the reasons he'd agreed to let her come in and be his financial advisor in the first place. And a lot of these titles for these cars and new toys were being put into Dee Dee's boyfriend's name. And from what I could tell, he was really young and dumb. I honestly don't think he had a clue what Dee Dee was even doing. He was just living his best sugar baby life, and, can you really be mad at that? Something else Dee Dee was doing, though, was writing off a lot of these big-ticket items on her taxes as gifts. Because you don't have to pay taxes on things that were gifted to you. Or at least you didn't have to pay taxes on gifts back then that I know of. I don't know about now. But the people closest to Abraham were starting to ask questions. He wasn't returning anyone's calls, and no one had been able to get in touch with him. And when people started asking Dee Dee if she'd heard from Abraham, Dee Dee told people that yes, she'd been in touch with Abraham, and that he was just taking some time away from life at the moment. He just needed some time to himself, that, the stress of the money had kind of gotten to Abraham, and he didn't really want to be found right now. That he was fine, though, and that she had talked to him, so not to worry. Abraham's best friend, Greg, said that he kind of assumed that Abraham had just finally decided to take this month-long cruise that he had been talking about since he'd won the lottery. But after people closest to Abraham started getting text messages from him, that's when they really started to worry. Abraham's ex-girlfriend, Centoya, said that when she and Abraham were still together, that when somebody would text him, Abraham would have to give her the phone so that she could read the text message to him. That's how much Abraham could not read or write. So how is he sending text messages to people? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And the only people who had claimed to have actually spoken to or seen Abraham was Dee Dee. Abraham seemed to have just vanished into thin air, and he was just nowhere to be found. He wasn't getting in touch with anyone. He wasn't responding when people reached out to him to get in touch with him. It was just really weird. And Dee Dee was still collecting mortgage payments and stuff from Abraham, and even keeping Abraham's family up to date on the latest news that she'd heard from Abraham. People were starting to get curious as to why he would only be keeping in touch with Dee Dee, though. And it doesn't help that Abraham had been telling his family and close friends that he was thinking about getting away and going on a cruise for a month or so, just to kind of get away from some of the headache that had been, had come along with him being the man that hit the lottery. Dee Dee had even had her attorney Howard go to court for Abraham, and since no one knew where he was, Abraham had fallen behind on his child support again, which should have been a red flag to everybody that knew him, because the very first thing that he did with his winnings was set his kids up. Like, he hit millions. I do not think he's fallen behind on his child support payments. He wasn't an absent dad. He wasn't a part-time dad. He was always present with his kids. Dee Dee's attorney Howard, however, told the courts that Abraham had been out of the country and that, this is the same lawyer that had written up the asset purchase agreement where Dee Dee had been able to buy everything of Abraham's for less than 5 cents on the dollar. So tell me the lawyer's in on it without telling me the lawyer's in on it. Now, Abraham's cousin Cedric, the one that Abraham had bought the house for, yep, that same cousin. Cedric had finally gone to the police to report Abraham as a missing person. But when Cedric got to the police station to report Abraham missing, he let the officers know that Dee Dee had actually paid him $5,000 to take Abraham's mom a birthday card. And this birthday card that Cedric had dropped off with Abraham's mom only had a $100 bill in it. Now, I feel like that's a pretty good amount for a regular birthday card, but Abraham strikes me as the type of person that would buy his mom a new car or a new flat-screen TV or a new laptop, like something big for her birthday, especially since he'd hit the lottery. I just don't see $100 in a birthday card that he had someone else drop off being something that he would have done. Abraham and his mom were extremely close. If nothing else, he would have at least dropped that birthday card off in person to his mom. Now, Dee Dee had already paid off the attorney Howard to draw up the necessary paperwork that she would need to show up in court in place of Abraham. Dee Dee had also paid off Abraham's personal assistant. And Dee Dee had paid off Abraham's personal assistant to tell people that she had either seen or heard from Abraham recently. So when family and friends would ask his personal assistant about if she'd seen or spoken to him, she would say yes. And when Dee Dee would see people around town that Abraham knew, she would say things like, "Oh, hey, Jerry, what's going on? Abraham was just talking about you yesterday. He said to tell you, hey, yeah, he's doing good." Like, she's a crazy person. But now the police knew about Dee Dee paying off Cedric for $5,000 for the birthday card, so the police concocted a plan of sorts. It didn't help that Cedric told police that even Dee Dee asking for that kind of favor with the birthday card made him feel like Abraham was probably more than just a missing person, and that Dee Dee probably knew what happened to him. Once investigators started asking Abraham's friends and family about when was the last time they'd actually seen Abraham in person, they all remembered that the last time they'd seen Abraham alive was in April. It was now November. No one had actually laid eyes on Abraham since April. And everyone who had quote-unquote heard from him had only heard from him through text messages, which is something that Abraham did not know how to do since he could not read or write. Police were smelling something fishy. They were about to get to the bottom of where Abraham had gone and what was going on. So investigators decided that since Abraham couldn't read or write and that he had miraculously learned how to text in the last few months, they figured that looking into Abraham's phone records was probably a good place to start. And when they did start looking into his phone records, they noticed that something just didn't seem right. On April 6th, text messages had started being sent from Abraham's phone. And when those texts were sent to his family and friends, Abraham's phone would be pinging in the same area and in the same phone towers and right on top of Dee Dee's phone. They then started looking at the pings from Abraham's phone and his outgoing call logs to Dee Dee's phone. So the calls that were being made from Abraham's phone to Dee Dee's phone. And that's when they realized that Abraham's phone, when it was calling Dee Dee, both phones were pinging at the same towers and in the same locations. Abraham wouldn't need to call Dee Dee on the phone if they were in the same place, like the phone pings were showing. In the documentary that I watched on this case, Abraham and Dee Dee's phones were basically sitting right on top of each other when Abraham was supposedly placing outgoing calls to Dee Dee's phone. Another thing to note is that Abraham's friends and family hadn't actually seen him since April, and that April was also when Abraham had miraculously learned how to text and was sending text messages to family and friends. So it's beginning to look a lot like whatever had happened to Abraham had happened in April. And Dee Dee seemed to be trying to be super helpful to the investigators throughout the investigation. She would drive 1 hour one way to the police station where she'd sit for hours and hours and hours, and even into the middle of the night to try to help with Abraham's investigation. That was until the two detectives working Abraham's case started their good cop, bad cop gig. And that must be when Dee Dee realized that all signs pointed directly to her. So when Dee Dee figured out that these detectives were likely starting to suspect her, this was about the same time that Dee Dee pulled her phone out to show the two detectives the video of Abraham. Now, in this video, Dee Dee's asking Abraham if he's ready to get away for a few months. Abraham told her that he was and that he wanted to get away for a while. Now, this is when the video shows Dee Dee asking Abraham if he was just tired of people begging and asking him for money. And again, Abraham answered that he was tired of being asked and begged for money constantly. The timestamp and date on this video was stamped for April 9th, which was 7 months before Abraham had finally been reported missing. And something to note about this video is how unbothered Abraham seems to be by Dee Dee recording him and asking him these random questions. Like he's literally standing in front of the TV with the remote control, just casually flipping through the channels and answering her as nonchalantly as possible when she'd ask a question. He doesn't seem to be taking these questions very seriously, and he doesn't seem to be answering Dee Dee with his whole chest. You know what I mean? Like, he's not saying, yes, I absolutely will be taking a trip. I need to get away. I need to clear my head. I don't know if I'll even be in touch with my mama or not. Like, he's literally like, yes, no, yes, yes, no. Actually, I'm going to play the audio for you here so you can hear the tone of his voice and what I mean. Like, I honestly don't even think he realized that Dee Dee was recording him while they were talking.
So where you want to go to?
It don't matter to me. I'm not a picky person.
California? Cozumel? You want a foreign country?
Baby.
Do you get tired of people asking you for money all the time, Abe?
I didn't tell him. A year ago.
Now, once police start putting all this together and finally piecing some of the puzzle pieces together, this is when Abraham's ex-girlfriend and second baby mama, Centoya, called police to let them know what had just happened. Dee Dee had just offered to sign over Abraham's house, which was worth $1 million, to Centoya, but only if Centoya would just call and tell those two detectives that are snooping around and working Abraham's case that she'd just seen Abraham in the flesh. So now Dee Dee's trying to bribe Centoya with Abraham's house and trying to get Centoya to lie to the detectives to say that she'd just seen Abraham. These two detectives are smart and they're kind of funny. The detectives call Dee Dee and they have her come down to the police station. When Dee Dee gets to the station, the detectives tell Dee Dee that they have great news. That Centoya had just called to let them know that she'd just seen Abraham. He's alive. He's okay. Centoya just saw him. Dee Dee cries and sobs and pretends like she's just so grateful to finally know that Abraham's okay. Meanwhile, the police already know that Centoya hadn't actually seen Abraham, and they already know that Dee Dee had tried to bribe Centoya into lying to the police about seeing Abraham. And I'd be willing to bet my last dollar that Dee Dee's fake crying and sighs of relief that Abraham was at least alive and okay were probably equally as bad as the reenactment that was done on the documentary on this case. So all of this is starting to come down pretty quickly on Dee Dee, and she's just reaching for any kind of straws to dig herself out of the mess that she's made. So Abraham's mom gets a call from someone who's claiming to be Abraham. But this is Abraham's mom. She's going to know whether it's her son or not, and this was not Abraham. But Abraham's mom was smart, and she knew that she needed to keep whoever this was that was pretending to be Abraham on the phone. She needed to keep them on the phone for at least a few minutes so that police would be able to track the call. Abraham's mom was able to keep this mystery man who was claiming to be Abraham on the phone for 8 minutes. Once the two finally hung up, Abraham's mom called the detectives to let them know what had just happened. And yes, she was sure that this wasn't Abraham. But now detectives need to figure out who made this call to Abraham's mom and where the call had actually originated from. The detectives were able to trace the call that was made to Abraham's mom back to Abraham's best friend, Greg. And when detectives were finally able to track Greg down, they actually found him in the car with Dee Dee. Now, detectives just kind of waited for Greg and Dee Dee to go their separate ways, and once Dee Dee had left, detectives kind of flagged Greg down. Detectives started asking Greg what was going on. Greg didn't even try to lie. Greg told detectives that Dee Dee had given him a few $100s to tell like some kinds of lies, which wasn't really the problem. The problem was that when that didn't work and Greg said no, Dee Dee had threatened to foreclose on Greg's house because she could do that now that she had managed to get everything signed over into her name months before this. So she would have actually been able to foreclose on Greg's house because Abraham had signed over all the mortgages that he'd gotten and for all of his friends and family over to Dee Dee prior to his disappearance. So Dee Dee technically could foreclose on Greg's home if she wanted to. But Greg told the detectives that he was more willing to help with whatever they needed, because at this point, Greg was also convinced that Dee Dee knew more than what she was letting on. So now the plan was to keep letting Dee Dee tell Greg anything that she was willing to tell him. Greg had agreed to wear a wire every time he met with Dee Dee and, record anything that was said. And what Dee Dee didn't know was that detectives working Abraham's case would be able to hear everything through that wire that Greg had agreed to wear when he'd meet up with Dee Dee. And this is when things finally start falling into place and making a lot more sense. Dee Dee had asked Greg to meet her at a hotel, and when Greg got to the hotel, Dee Dee was waiting there with a letter for Greg. Now, according to what Dee Dee told Greg, this letter was supposed to be from Abraham. And again, Dee Dee had asked Greg to deliver this letter to Abraham's mom. This is supposed to be a letter from Abraham, and Greg's going to drop it off with Abraham's mom. And I'm, again, going to stress the fact that Abraham can't read or write. And I don't keep harping on this for no reason. How is Abraham supposedly writing a letter to his mom when he never learned to read or write? Exactly, he wouldn't be able to. And apparently, Dee Dee kept forgetting this fact that Abraham couldn't read or write too. But Dee Dee hadn't forgotten about DNA. Somehow, she'd managed to remember that DNA was a thing. Because when Greg had first gotten to the hotel to meet with Dee Dee about this letter, she pulled out a laptop and she started typing this letter up on her laptop. Before she did that, though, Dee Dee put on a hairnet. She also put on a face mask along with latex gloves, just like the kind of gloves that a surgeon would wear. But that's not all that Dee Dee used to keep her DNA off of this letter that she was typing up that was supposed to be coming from Abraham. No, she wasn't quite done yet. She'd also put on footy covers over her shoes, the same kinds of gear that fathers would have to wear if they're going into the operating room for a C-section to deliver their newborn infant with their wife. And Dee Dee thought about all these things, but somehow she kept forgetting the fact that Abraham never learned to read or write. Now, Dee Dee's putting on all of these protective layers to keep her DNA off of this letter that she's typing up for Greg to drop off with Abraham's mom. So Greg was watching her put this hairnet on, these gloves, this face mask, these footies, and obviously, Dee Dee really thinks that she can trust Greg, and Dee Dee actually trusted Greg enough that she asked if Greg knew anyone that might be willing to take the fall for Abraham's death. Then Dee Dee threw in the fact that if Greg did know someone who would be willing to take the fall for Abraham's murder, that she would be willing to pay whoever would take the fall for Abraham's death $50,000. Greg told Dee Dee that he knew the perfect person. Greg knew someone that was about to be spending a good stretch of time in prison anyways, and that he would probably be more than willing to take the $50,000 and say that he's the one that killed Abraham. But just like in a lot of these cases, the guy that Greg knew that would be willing to take the fall for Abraham's death was really just a beefed up undercover police officer. They always appear so criminal, like they're always tatted up and super beefy, and they don't look like police officers, which I guess that's why it works. Now, this undercover officer was going to be going by the name of Mike for the sting operation. And his cover story was that he was already about to be going into prison to start serving his 25-year prison sentence. And that undercover officer, Mike, was Greg's cousin. So this 25-year prison sentence and the fact that Mike was an undercover officer who was playing Greg's cousin is all a part of this cover story that Greg is feeding to Dee Dee. And as soon as Greg introduces undercover officer known as Mike to Dee Dee, she wasn't even trying to hide what she'd done at this point, because she honestly believed that she'd outsmarted these detectives. And if she could just pin Abraham's murder on Greg's fake cousin Mike, then, well, Dee Dee would in turn escape her own prison sentence for Abraham's murder. Dee Dee didn't know Greg's cousin Mike from the guy at the gas station, but she blindly trusted Greg and what he was telling her about his cousin Mike. So once Dee Dee was introduced to Undercover Mike by Abraham's best friend Greg, Undercover Mike first demanded that he was going to need to know where Abraham's body was located. If he was going to take the fall for this murder, he would have to know where the body was in order to make this believable and convince these detectives that he'd been the one that actually murdered Abraham. And Dee Dee wasn't shy at all, like not in the slightest. She was trying to get this deal made and be done with this investigation into Abraham's disappearance. And now detectives knew that they weren't just looking for an alive Abraham, that they were about to find out, without a shadow of a doubt, that Abraham was in fact already dead. Now, Mike told Dee Dee that he would need to know where Abraham's body was in order to make his confession sound believable, so that he could, move Abraham's body to a place that wasn't associated with Dee Dee in any way. Mike also told Dee Dee that he was going to need the murder weapon that she used to kill Abraham so that he would be able to sell his story. Because at this point, no one knew if Abraham had been stabbed or shot or poisoned or, what. And Undercover Mike was fishing for all the details. So once Dee Dee heard Mike out, and after Mike explained to Dee Dee why he would need all of these key pieces of information, Dee Dee folded like a piece of notebook paper, and she gave Undercover Mike everything. Dee Dee told Mike, who, mind you, was an undercover officer, where Abraham's body was. She also gave him the .22 caliber gun that she'd used to kill Abraham, and Dee Dee had even taken Mike back to her own backyard to show him where she had a 30-foot by 30-foot concrete slab, all while telling him that Abraham had been buried underneath this concrete slab in her backyard. Mike told Dee Dee that he would be coming back to her house later that same night so that he could dig Abraham's body up to be able to move it to a different spot that would be more believable and a spot that had no ties back to Dee Dee, because Abraham being buried in Dee Dee's backyard would be a little too obvious. Dee Dee had been living in this house and renting the house out next door to hers, having barbecues and bonfires and family gatherings, and whatever else you would normally do in your own backyard when you don't have a dead body buried there. Dee Dee was living in this house so normally and so unbothered by the fact that Abraham's dead body was buried in her backyard. Now, while Dee Dee was showing Undercover Mike where she'd buried Abraham's dead body in her backyard, Abraham's best friend Greg had been with Dee Dee and Mike. So she's showing both of these men all of this overwhelming evidence that she was just spewing out like uncontrollable word vomit. Like crucial things like where Abraham's body was buried and giving Undercover Mike the gun that she'd used to kill Abraham. Greg had been there with Mike and Dee Dee through all of that. And investigators had kind of told Greg and Mike both to just go along with whatever Dee Dee was planning until they told them otherwise. So that's exactly what they did. Once Mike and Greg had left from Dee Dee's house, Dee Dee and Greg met up to go over like the nitty-gritty details one more time. Just so that they could both make sure that they were on the same page with their story that they would be trying to sell to police. Now, this story would be that Undercover Mike had been the one that murdered Abraham, and they needed to go over all the details to make sure that this story would work. But it was during this meeting where Dee Dee and Greg are going over all the details in depth that the investigators who had been working Abraham's case finally interrupted this meeting and took Dee Dee in for questioning. Now, once the investigators were questioning Dee Dee, her plan was simple. Deny, deny, deny. She would even go on and tell investigators that Abraham's best friend Greg had actually been the one that murdered him. Also telling investigators that Greg had even admitted to her that he'd been the one that killed Abraham. And these investigators were pretty well-mannered because they let Dee Dee finish spewing her stack of lies before they brought out the audio recording that Greg had gotten of Dee Dee. Because Greg had been wearing a wire every time that he'd met with Dee Dee after that first time the investigators had confronted Greg. He'd been working with investigators since then. Now, Dee Dee wasn't going down without a fight. That didn't work, so she tried blaming literally everyone but herself. Dee Dee had even tried throwing her own son under the bus when she told investigators that her own son had been the one that had shot Abraham. Dee Dee claimed that her son had walked in on Abraham choking her and that her son had just flipped out and shot Abraham for choking his mom. Now, investigators did bring in Dee Dee's son to question him about this case, and literally Dee Dee's son was like, hold on, I supposedly killed who? For what? Like, Dee Dee's son had absolutely no idea what these investigators were even talking about. And police started talking to other people that knew Dee Dee, and they ran across Dee Dee's ex-husband who had some interesting things to tell investigators. Dee Dee's ex-husband recalled several months earlier when Dee Dee had called him and asked him to bring his backhoe over to her house. Now, she needed him to bring his backhoe over so that he could dig her a hole, which she said she was going to fill with concrete. Who the hell digs a hole just to fill it with concrete? Absolutely no one, that's who. Dee Dee's ex-husband also let investigators know that he had dug a few holes in Dee Dee's backyard with his backhoe before this, so this wasn't like an unusual request. But that makes me wonder why Dee Dee was needing so many holes dug, and not just like dug like a 1-foot hole in the ground with like a shovel kind of hole. No, like deep enough of a hole that she would need her ex-husband to bring a backhoe over. A backhoe is like one of those huge construction type of machines with the bucket on the front that's big enough to literally fit like 8 grown men comfortably, and you'd probably still have room in the bucket. So it would be digging like feet into the ground with each scoop. So like what would she need those holes to be that big for? I get that she buried Abraham's body under a concrete slab for one of the holes, but what about all the other holes? Like, what were in those holes? What were those holes for? Dee Dee's ex-husband also told investigators that he had come back to Dee Dee's house later that day to fill the hole up with dirt that he'd already dug. But when he arrived, Dee Dee was outside at the hole with a shovel covered in sweat and dirt. Once investigators brought equipment in to dig up Dee Dee's backyard, they recovered Abraham's body, but it took them 2 days to recover his remains. Abraham had finally been recovered from inside of a concrete slab that Dee Dee had put in her backyard. And then when they did recover Abraham's body, he was still in those same clothes that he'd been seen in on that video that Dee Dee had showed police earlier in the investigation. The video of Abraham saying that he was ready to get away and that, he didn't really care where. And he had likely been killed sometime shortly after Dee Dee had filmed that video that she would then try to use later to claim that Abraham had just ran away from his life. And finally, after months of Dee Dee lying to everyone around her, police finally had enough evidence to charge Dee Dee with the first-degree murder of Abraham Shakespeare. It would take roughly 2.5 years for the trial to begin, but when it did, the jury came back with a verdict of guilty on all charges. It had only taken the jury 3 hours to deliberate, which isn't a very long deliberation period. And after the guilty verdict was handed down, the judge and the jury both agreed that life in prison would be a fitting sentence for Dee Dee and her crimes. Dee Dee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for a felony gun charge that police had tacked on for good measure. After the trial and the sentencing, Abraham's family was able to eventually recover the majority of the money and the properties that Dee Dee had stolen or tricked Abraham into signing over. And I think that is it. I think we just finished our first bonus episode ever for Patreon. I'm pretty excited. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll have another bonus episode next month, and Wednesday we'll have our regular episode on our regular feed. All right, y'all, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next month. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast. That's how my mama murdered a podcast.